Well, New South Wales Liberal Senator Concetta Fierravanti-Wells has crossed the Senate floor to vote with the crossbench over an inquiry into relations with China. Now, both sides of politics voted down the motion to push for a probe into the country's relationship with China amid rising trade tensions. Senator Fierravanti-Wells says it's important for Australia to diversify its trade relations in a bid to reduce economic dependency on China. She joins me now. Senator, thanks for joining us tonight. You've been very, very strong on this. You wouldn't have taken that step lightly this afternoon. Why did you do it?
Well, Peter, I've been in this place now for over 15 years and this is the first time that I crossed the floor. I did so on principle. I thought it was an important reference inquiry to support. I've been consistent in my warnings in relation to the communist regime for a long, long time. And therefore, I feel that it is important for us to examine the whole ambit of our relationship with the communist regime in Beijing. I think it's time that we do reduce our dependency. And when you do look at just how insidious in some cases this relationship has become, I think it's important, particularly as Australians are expecting us to ensure that it's not going to be business as usual with the communist regime post-pandemic. And so, therefore, I felt that this was a timely and appropriate inquiry. I mean, of course, the Senate, over its history, and particularly over its 50-year history, which we commended today of its committee system, has undertaken some very complex and at times controversial inquiries. And so I think that at this point in time, the whole relationship needs to be looked at, particularly as we plan towards a decoupling of Australia and reduce the dependency on communist China.
Senator, you're absolutely right. I've watched you over the last few years and your response to the encroachment, particularly in the South Pacific, of the way in which the Chinese have muscled in on our South Pacific neighbours with their Belt and Road approach. And of course, we'll talk about Victoria very, very shortly. But you have been consistent. You've been very much a lone voice in this area, warning Australia that the Chinese do have sinister motives when it comes to the way in which they invest and they provide loans, cheap loans to, countries like Vanuatu and Fiji and Papua New Guinea and of course the Samoas. And I think, that should be called out. That's a very admirable stance that you've portrayed.
Thank you, Peter. And that's what I did in 2018. I spent a lot of time travelling to the Pacific. I did about 35 trips, extensive travel to smaller islands as well. So I saw for myself, Peter, what was happening out there. So therefore, when I did give those warnings, I gave it on the basis of what I was observing, what I was hearing and what people were saying to me. And really, when you look at what was happening there, it became known as debt trap diplomacy. Following my comments, an international debate ensued in relation to what the communist regime was doing, not just, of course, in the Pacific, but right across the world. And so we've seen bit by bit the way it has used debt in a way, a deliberate way, and we've seen the Belt and Road expand to effectively be, I mean, for me, Belt and Road equals debt trap diplomacy, and we know what happens. Countries borrow more than they can pay, for often assets that are not economic and are not productive. And then ultimately, of course, we don't always know, Peter, what the terms of these loans are. Inevitably, they are debt for equity. So that means when they can't pay, then the entity that lent money, in this case either the Chinese bank or the entity, then takes equity. And we've seen that happening right across the world. And so therefore, that's why this is so insidious, and this is one of the reasons why I've been very, very critical about BRI and in particular what Daniel Andrews is proposing in Victoria.
Well, I was going to say, Concetta, I mean, you must be incredibly disappointed at what's going on in Victoria.
Well, I'm disappointed at not only what's happening in Victoria, but also across the board. I mean, let's not forget, Peter, that it was interesting to see Alex Joske, and I'm not sure if you've seen the report that came out from ASPI in the last couple of days, and it actually goes into a lot of detail about the insidious nature of the communist regime's activities in Australia across associations, across business elites, across the universities, through its Confucius institutes, and all of those things, which actually just goes to show the length and breadth of their activities here in Australia. Please don't get me wrong, Peter. I think it's important that we do have good relationships with countries right across the world. But the problem here is that we have put a third of our trade eggs in one basket. Now, that's economics 101 is you don't put all your eggs in one basket, and the university sector has perhaps been very guilty of not following the tenets of its own business schools that are talking and teaching diversification, but they themselves haven't done it. And why haven't they done it? And why has there been the situation that we see today? Because whilst the rivers of gold, Peter, were flowing, whether it was in the in exports, in other things, in universities, in a whole range of different areas, we turned a blind eye to the skullduggery of the communist regime. We adopted a policy of appeasement, and we have seen our exports to China rise to about 33%. And now, of course, we find ourselves dependent, and we've seen it through the pandemic, where we're so dependent for our supply chains, and we have to loosen that dependency.
Senator Fierravanti-Wells, thank you for joining us tonight. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Peter. It's a pleasure.